The chandeliers were still trembling when the gunshots echoed off the velvet walls. Smoke curled toward the ceiling in slow, lazy spirals, and for one frozen second, nobody in that casino dared to breathe. A woman's champagne glass shattered on the marble floor. A man in a gray suit dropped his cigar mid-sentence. And in the center of it all stood a giant. A man so large he seemed to swallow the light from the chandeliers above him, his fists clenched, his chest heaving, staring down the barrel of a Tommy gun like it was nothing more than a child's toy pointed in his direction. Behind him, slumped in a chair with a red handprint blooming across his cheek, sat a man the world knew as a crooner, a charmer, a smile that could light up 1,000 stages. But in that moment, he wasn't smiling. He was staring straight ahead, jaw tight, humiliation burning hotter than the sting on his face. This was the night everything changed. This was the night a mob boss made the worst mistake of his life. The night he laid a hand on a man named Dean, not knowing that somewhere in that smoke-filled room, a giant was about to make him pay for it in front of everyone who mattered in that city. To understand how it got to this point, how a slap in a casino nearly became a bloodbath, how a gentle giant became the most feared man in a room full of killers, you have to go back to a time when Las Vegas wasn't just a city. It was a kingdom built on neon and secrets, on marble floors that had trapdoors, on smiling maitre d's who reported every whispered conversation straight to men who never smiled at all. It was a place where the entertainment was real, the diamonds were real, but almost nothing else was what it seemed. Dean had been the toast of that city for years. He was the kind of performer who could walk onto a stage with a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, crack a joke about his own drinking, then launch into a ballad so smooth it made grown men misty-eyed and women forget their husbands were sitting right beside them. Audiences adored him because he never seemed to be trying too hard. That was his gift, the illusion of effortlessness, the sense that the whole world was just one big party, and he was simply the guy who happened to be holding the microphone. But behind that easy charm was a man who understood, better than almost anyone in that business, exactly how the game worked. The casinos that packed his shows were not owned by hotel chains or corporations. They were owned quietly through shell companies and silent partners, by men who came from Chicago, from New York, from Kansas City, men whose real business had nothing to do with entertainment and everything to do with control. Dean knew their names. He knew their tempers. And he knew that the smile he wore on stage sometimes had to extend backstage too, into private rooms where handshakes were exchanged with men who could make problems disappear or create them. For years, that arrangement worked. Dean sang. The casino floors filled up, the money moved through pit bosses and back rooms like blood through veins, and everybody understood the unspoken rules. But there was one man who never quite understood or never cared to respect where the line was supposed to be drawn. His name doesn't matter as much as his reputation did. Around that city, they called him the boss, and not with affection. He was a stocky man with cold eyes and a temper that could snap in an instant. The kind of man who had built his fortune not through charm but through fear, who believed that every person in his casino, from the cocktail waitresses to the headline performers, belonged to him the moment they stepped through his doors. He had never liked Dean. Maybe it was jealousy. The boss controlled the money, but Dean controlled the room. When Dean sang, people forgot who owned the casino. They only remembered the man on stage, the voice, the charisma, the laughter. And there is nothing a man like the boss hates more than being forgotten in his own kingdom, even for just one night. That resentment simmered for months, maybe years, hidden behind polite handshakes and forced smiles at press events. Until one night, it didn't stay hidden any longer. It was a Saturday night in the middle of a heat wave, the kind of desert heat that clung to your skin even inside air-conditioned hallways. The casino floor was packed wall to wall. High rollers from Texas, oil money from Oklahoma, a senator's aide trying not to be recognized, and in the middle of it all, seated at a private card table near the back of the room, sat the boss himself, flanked by two men in dark suits who never seemed to blink. Dean had just finished his second set of the night. He was tired. The good kind of tired, the kind that comes after giving an audience everything you have and watching them stand up and roar for more. He'd loosened his tie, poured himself a drink, and wandered over toward the high-stakes tables to say hello to a few old friends, the way he always did after a show. It was tradition. It was part of the magic of that city. The idea that even the biggest star in the room was still just one of the guys, still willing to shake your hand and share a laugh at the blackjack table. But that night, something was different. The boss had been losing, badly. Word had already spread through the pit that he dropped nearly $200,000 in under an hour, and men like the boss did not lose gracefully. Losing chipped away at something deeper than his wallet. It chipped away at the image he'd spent decades building, the image of a man who was never at the mercy of anyone or anything, not even luck itself. So when Dean strolled over, flashing that easy grin, clapping a hand on the boss's shoulder and saying something light, something meant as nothing more than a friendly joke about the cards not cooperating tonight, the boss did not laugh. His face went rigid. His eyes, usually cold, turned to something closer to fury. And in front of dozens of witnesses, dealers, pit bosses, wealthy guests, even a young cocktail waitress who would later swear she felt her knees go weak from the shock of what she witnessed, the boss rose from his chair and without a single word of warning, struck Dean across the face. The sound of it cracked through the room like a whip. For a moment, the entire casino floor seemed to freeze. The spinning roulette was slowed to a stop in someone's peripheral memory. The clinking of chips fell silent. Even the orchestra in the lounge next door seemed to hold its final note a beat too long. Dean's head snapped to the side. His drink slipped from his hand and shattered against the floor. And when he turned back to face the man who had just struck him in front of half the city's elite, there was no anger in his eyes. Not yet. There was something far more dangerous. Disbelief. The kind of disbelief that comes when you realize, in an instant, exactly how little you actually mean to the people who claim to be your friends. Nobody moved. Nobody dared. Because everybody in that room understood an unwritten law of that world. You did not intervene when a boss decided to make an example of someone, no matter who that someone happened to be. Even the most powerful entertainer in Las Vegas was, in that moment, just another man who could be humiliated on a whim. And the silence in that room was the sound of dozens of people quietly, desperately hoping the situation would end there. It didn't, because standing near the far end of the casino floor that night, dressed in an ill-fitting suit that strained across shoulders built for a different kind of life entirely, was a man the world would eventually come to know as one of the most extraordinary human beings ever to walk into a wrestling ring. A giant of man whose real name few people bothered to use. Because the moment you saw him, giant was the only word that fit. He stood nearly 7.5 feet tall, with hands the size of dinner plates and a chest built like a barrel of iron. He'd been hired that season as part of the casino's entertainment lineup, brought in to headline an exhibition wrestling match scheduled for the following week, a novelty act meant to draw crowds who wanted to see a living legend up close. He wasn't supposed to be involved in casino politics. He wasn't supposed to understand the delicate, dangerous hierarchy of that world, but he had been standing close enough to see everything. The slap, the shattering glass, the way Dean's proud shoulders sagged for just a moment before he forced them back up, the way the boss straightened his jacket as if striking a beloved entertainer in front of 200 witnesses was simply part of his evening's entertainment. And something inside that giant, something quiet, something that had been building for years of watching powerful men abuse people who couldn't fight back, finally broke. He didn't shout. He didn't rush across the room in a blind rage. In fact, witnesses later described his approach as almost unervingly calm, each footstep deliberate, the crowd instinctively parting before him the way water parts before an approaching ship. The boss's bodyguards noticed him first. Two men who suddenly found themselves staring not at each other, not at Dean, but upward at a wall of a man closing the distance between them with an expression that made their trained instincts scream at them to reach for something. By the time the giant reached the table, the boss had already turned back to his cards, already dismissing the incident as though it were nothing more than swatting away a fly. He didn't even look up at first. "Sit down, big man," he muttered, waving a hand without bothering to check who he was speaking to. "This doesn't concern you." The giant did not sit down. Instead, in a voice that seemed to rumble up from somewhere deep in his chest, low and steady, he said the words that would echo through that casino for years afterward, whispered in hushed conversations at bars and card tables long after the incident itself had faded into legend. "You don't put your hands on a man who can't hit back. Not while I'm standing here." The boss finally looked up, and whatever he saw in that moment, the size of the man before him, The stillness in his eyes, the complete absence of fear. It should have been enough to make him reconsider everything that happened next. But men like the boss did not build empires by backing down in front of an audience, and pride, as it so often does in stories like this one, was about to make a catastrophic decision on his behalf. He snapped his fingers. It was such a small gesture, 2 fingers, 1 quick motion. But in that world, it meant everything. It was a command, a summons. And within seconds, from the shadows near the private elevators, from behind curtained doorways that led to rooms most guests never saw, men began to appear. Not 2 or 3, but 6, then 8, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this exact thing more times than anyone in that room wanted to imagine. Jackets that bulged slightly at the hip, expressions that had long since stopped registering anything resembling human warmth. The casino floor, which moments earlier had been humming with the sounds of celebration and chants, fell into a silence so complete you could hear the ice melting in abandoned drinks. Dean, still nursing the sting on his cheek, rose slowly from his seat, his eyes darting between the giant and the gathering wall of armed men, and for the first time that night, real fear crept into his expression. Not fear for himself, but fear for the man who had just stepped forward to defend him, a man who, for all his extraordinary size and strength, was still just one person against 8 armed enforcers in a room built entirely to serve the boss's interests. "You don't have to do this," Dean said quietly, his voice trembling slightly beneath its usual smooth control. "Walk away, please." But the giant did not walk away. He simply turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Dean's eyes, and offered the faintest ghost of a reassuring smile. The kind of smile a man gives when he has already decided something and doesn't need anyone else's permission to see it through. "I've been walking away my whole life," the giant said. "Not tonight. What happened in the next several minutes has been told and retold so many times, in so many versions, that separating fact from embellishment became almost impossible for anyone who wasn't standing in that room. But those who were there, and there were dozens of them, dealers and waitresses and gamblers who would spend the rest of their lives telling this story to anyone who would listen, agreed on the broad strokes of what unfolded. The first man to reach for his weapon never got the chance to raise it. The giant's arm moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his size, closing around a man's wrist and lifted him clean off the ground as though he weighed nothing more than a child's toy. The gun clattered uselessly to the marble floor. A second man lunged from the side, and the giant simply pivoted, using the first man's own body as a shield and a weapon, sending both enforcers crashing into a nearby card table in an explosion of scattered chips and shattered wine glasses. Screaming erupted from somewhere near the slot machines. A woman in a beaded gown scrambled backward, dragging her stunned husband with her. Somewhere in the chaos, a security guard reached for a phone to call for backup that would take, by every account, far too long to arrive. By the time 3 more enforcers had circled around, weapons finally drawn and aimed, the giant had positioned himself squarely between the gunman and Dean, his massive frame a human wall, his breathing heavy but his eyes utterly, terrifyingly calm. "Shoot me," he said, his voice carrying across the frozen casino floor with a weight that made even the boss's confident sneer falter for first time that night. "Go ahead, but you'll have to explain to every reporter, every senator, every high roller standing in this room right now, exactly why you murdered a man in cold blood over a slap that never should have happened in the first place." It was, in retrospect, the perfect thing to say, not because it was heroic, though it certainly was, but because it was strategic in a way that revealed the giant understood something crucial about the world he had just stepped into. Men like the boss did not fear violence. They feared exposure. They feared headlines. They feared the kind of scrutiny that came when powerful, wealthy witnesses had a story to tell that painted their carefully constructed empire as nothing more than a house of thugs playing dress-up in expensive suits. And there, standing frozen among the crowd, were exactly the kind of witnesses the boss could not afford to alienate: oil barons, a state senator's closest aide, out-of-town financiers whose continued patronage kept that casino's vault overflowing. If even one of them walked away from that night and quietly mentioned to the wrong reporter, the wrong federal investigator, that they had personally witnessed an unprovoked shooting in the middle of a crowded casino floor, the consequences would ripple far beyond anything the boss could control with money or muscle alone. For a long, agonizing moment, Nobody moved. The enforcers glanced toward their boss, waiting for a signal, a nod, anything that would tell them whether to pull the trigger or stand down. The tension stretched so thin it felt as though the entire room might shatter along with it. And then the boss did something nobody expected. He laughed. It wasn't a genuine laugh. Everyone in that room could hear the strain beneath it. The forced quality of man trying desperately to salvage his dignity in front of an audience that had just watched him lose control of his own casino floor. "Stand down, boys," he said, waving a dismissive hand as though the entire confrontation had been nothing more than an amusing bit of theater. "We don't need to make a mess tonight." The enforcers lowered their weapons, though their eyes remained locked on the giant with a mixture of confusion and simmering resentment. Slowly, cautiously, the tension in the room began to thaw, though the silence that followed carried a different kind of weight entirely. The weight of an entire city realizing, in real time, that something fundamental had just shifted. The boss straightened his jacket one final time, forcing his expression back into something resembling composure. Though the fury still burning behind his eyes told a very different story than the calm mask he was trying to wear. He looked at Dean first, his gaze lingering with an unmistakable promise of consequences yet to come. Then he looked at the giant, and for just a moment, something almost like respect flickered across his face before vanishing back into cold calculation. "You've made a very powerful enemy tonight, big man," the boss said quietly, his voice low enough that only those closest could hear it. "I hope you understand that." The giant did not flinch. "I've made worse enemies than you," he replied, "and I'm still standing." With that, the boss turned and walked away, his entourage falling into step behind him, disappearing to the private doors near the elevators, leaving behind a casino floor buzzing with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to celebration. Because whatever else that confrontation had been, everyone who witnessed it understood one undeniable truth. For the first time in longer than anyone could remember, someone had stood up to that world of untouchable men and walked away not just alive, but victorious. But if anyone in that room believed the story ended there, believed that a public humiliation could simply be forgotten, that a man like the boss would allow such profound loss of face to go unanswered, they severely underestimated exactly how dangerous the coming days would become. News of the confrontation spread through the city with the speed and hunger of a wildfire. By morning, whispers had turned into full conversations in every coffee shop, every casino break room, every hotel lobby within a 5-mile radius. Some versions of the story exaggerated the violence into an all-out gunfight. Others downplayed it into a minor scuffle blown out of proportion. But the core of it, a mob boss slapping the city's most beloved entertainer, and a giant of man standing between him, and a firing squad of hired guns, remained consistent no matter who was telling the tale. Dean, for his part, spent the following day in a state of quiet turmoil that few people ever saw beneath his usual easy charm. He canceled his afternoon rehearsal, something almost unheard of for a performer known throughout the industry for his relentless professionalism. He sat instead in his private suite, staring out over the desert skyline, replaying the events of the previous night over and over in his mind, wrestling with a guilt that gnawed at him more painfully than the humiliation of the slap itself. Because Dean understood something that the excited crowds gossiping in casino hallways did not fully grasp. He understood the kind of man the boss truly was beneath the tailored suits and charming public persona. He understood that humiliation in that world was rarely met with mere words. It was met with consequences, sometimes swift, sometimes patient, but always, eventually, delivered. And the man who had stepped forward to protect him, the giant who had risked his life without a moment's hesitation, was now squarely in the crosshairs of one of the most dangerous men in the entire western United States. That evening, as the sun began its slow, blazing descent behind the mountains, Dean made his way to the giant's dressing room backstage, a modest space cluttered with wrestling gear and framed photographs from arenas across the country. He found the giant seated on a bench far too small for his massive frame, quietly wrapping tape around knuckles that had grown swollen and bruised in the previous night's confrontation. "You shouldn't have done that," Dean said quietly, closing the door behind him. "You don't know what these people are capable of." The giant looked up, and for the first time since Dean had met him weeks earlier during rehearsals for the wrestling exhibition, he saw something vulnerable behind those famously intimidating eyes. Not fear exactly, but a weariness that spoke of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, mocked, and exploited by people who saw him only as a spectacle rather than a human being with feelings that could be wounded just as easily as anyone else's. You know what it's like? The giant said slowly, to walk into a room and have every single person stare at you like you're not even human? Like you're just a thing to be gawked at, laughed at, used to sell tickets? He paused, flexing his taped fingers. I've spent my whole life being looked at like that. But last night, for the first time in longer than I can remember, somebody looked at me and saw a person who could actually make a difference. I wasn't going to let that slip away just because I was scared of what might happen afterward. Dean sat down slowly across from him, the weight of the giant's words settling over him with unexpected force. Even if it costs you everything? The giant considered the question for a long moment before answering, his voice carrying a quiet conviction that Dean would remember for the rest of his life. Some things are worth more than staying safe, he said. You taught me that, in a strange way, standing up there every night, letting people see you, knowing that some of the folks watching you sing are the same folks capable of destroying you if you step out of line. That takes a kind of courage most people never have to find. I just decided it was my turn to find mine. It was a moment that would define both of their lives moving forward, though neither of them could have fully understood. In that dimly lit dressing room, exactly how far the consequences of that single act of courage were about to ripple outward, because the boss, humiliated in front of the very people whose respect and continued patronage his empire depended upon, was not a man who let such wounds heal naturally. Within 48 hours, quiet conversations began taking place in back rooms far from public view. Conversations between the boss and associates from out of state. Men whose names rarely appeared in newspapers, but whose influence stretched across entire regions of organized criminal enterprise. The question being discussed in those smoke-filled rooms was simple and chilling. How does a man like the boss reclaim his authority without inviting the kind of scrutiny that could bring federal investigators sniffing around operations that had taken decades to build? The answer they arrived at was patient, calculated, and far more dangerous than any of the sudden, chaotic violence that had erupted on casino floor that first night. They decided to isolate the giant. Word came down through casino management within days that the wrestling exhibition schedule for the following week had been postponed indefinitely due to unforeseen circumstances. His contract, quietly and without explanation, was terminated. Hotel rooms that had been reserved for him and his small traveling entourage were suddenly, mysteriously unavailable. Local promoters who had eagerly booked him for appearances throughout the region began canceling one by one, citing vague excuses that never quite added up, their voices carrying an unmistakable nervousness whenever the giant's manager pressed for real explanations. It was, in its own quiet way, just as menacing as any direct threat of violence. An entire city's entertainment industry, controlled almost entirely by men loyal to or fearful of the boss, systematically closing its doors to a man who had dared to embarrass one of its most powerful figures. Dean watched this unfold with mounting horror, understanding all too well the mechanics of what was happening. He made calls of his own, calling in favors from producers and club owners who owed him from years of loyal partnership, trying desperately to find work, any work, for the man who had risked everything to protect him. Some doors remained open quietly, cautiously. Others slammed shut the moment Dean's intentions became clear. Their owners, too frightened of the boss's reach to risk their own livelihoods for a stranger's cause. It was during this tense, uncertain period that the true depth of the conspiracy began to reveal itself piece by piece in ways that neither Dean nor the giant could have anticipated. A private investigator, hired quietly by one of Dean's few remaining trusted allies within the casino industry, began digging into the boss's finances, hoping to find some piece of leverage that might protect the giant from further retaliation. What that investigator uncovered was far more explosive than anyone expected. Buried within layers of shell companies and offshore accounts was evidence suggesting the boss had been skimming money not just from his own casino's daily earnings, but from a shared pool of funds controlled by an entire network of criminal organizations spread across multiple states. Money that was supposed to be distributed among several powerful families, but which had instead been quietly funneled into the boss's personal accounts for years. If that information ever reached the wrong ears, or rather, exactly the right ears, the boss would find himself facing an enemy far more dangerous than a giant wrestler or humiliated crooner. He would find himself facing the wrath of his own criminal associates, men who did not tolerate betrayal within their own ranks under any circumstances. The investigator brought this information to Dean late one night, meeting in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of the city, where they were unlikely to be recognized. Dean listened in stunned silence as the details were laid out before him, understanding immediately the impossible position this new knowledge placed him in. If he did nothing, the boss would continue his quiet campaign to destroy the giant's career and reputation, patiently squeezing him out every opportunity until he had no choice but to leave the region entirely, defeated and humiliated. But if Dean chose to use this explosive information as leverage, threatening to expose the boss's financial betrayal to his own criminal partners unless he called off his retaliation, he would be stepping directly into a game of such extraordinary danger that even the most seasoned entertainers in that world rarely dare to play it. Dean spent that night wrestling with an agonizing decision, understanding that whatever path he chose next would irreversibly alter not just his own life, but the lives of everyone connected to this unfolding drama. He thought about the giant, a man who had sacrificed his career and potentially his life for a stranger's dignity. He thought about the countless reformers throughout that city who lived under the same unspoken threats, who smiled through their shows while quietly terrified of men controlling every aspect of their livelihoods. And he thought about his own reputation, built over years of careful navigation through a world where one wrong move could end a career or a life. In an instant, by dawn, Dean had made his decision. He requested a private meeting with the boss, choosing neutral ground, a quiet restaurant known for its discretion, away from the casino floors and prying eyes of witnesses who might later be called upon to testify about whatever was about to unfold. The boss arrived flanked by only 2 bodyguards this time, his expression carrying a wary curiosity beneath its usual cold composure, clearly uncertain what to expect from a man he had publicly humiliated just days earlier. What followed was a conversation conducted so quietly, so carefully, that the waiter serving their table later admitted he could never quite piece together exactly what was being discussed, though he distinctly remembered the moment the boss's face went pale, his hand trembling slightly as he set down his coffee cup with unusual care. Dean laid out, calmly and without a trace of the anger that had simmered within him for days, exactly what his private investigator had discovered. He made no threats, no dramatic ultimatums. He simply explained, with the same effortless charm that had made him beloved on stages across the country, that certain information had come into his possession, and that the continued well-being and career prospects of a particular giant wrestler would determine whether that information remained a private matter between the two of them or found its way into far more dangerous hands. The boss listened in silence, his jaw tightening with every word, understanding immediately the impossible position he now found himself in. To retaliate against Dean now would only increase the likelihood that this devastating information would be exposed to his criminal partners, men who would show him none of the mercy or restraint that Dean was currently extending. But to simply capitulate, to call off his campaign against a giant and allow the humiliation of that casino floor confrontation to stand unanswered, felt like an admission of weakness he could scarcely stomach. In the end, self-preservation won out over pride, as it so often does among men whose entire identities are built upon careful calculations of risk and reward. The boss agreed, through gritted teeth and barely concealed fury, to quietly restore the giant's contracts, to instruct his associates throughout the region's entertainment industry to lift whatever informal blacklisting had been enacted, and to never again lay a hand on Dean or interfere with his career in any capacity. It was, in its own strange way, a victory forged not through violence, but through the same careful, calculated leverage that men like the boss had always used to maintain their own power, turned back against him by a performer far more shrewd than his charming, easygoing stage persona had ever let on. Word of this resolution never fully made its way into public gossip the way the initial confrontation had. There were no dramatic headlines, no sensational newspaper stories about mob bosses and secret financial betrayals. The entire matter was handled with the quiet discretion that world demanded, a private war fought and won entirely behind closed doors, its true details known only to a handful of people who understood exactly how close that city had come to witnessing violence of a much more permanent nature. But within the casino industry itself, within the tight-knit community of performers, dealers, and staff who had witnessed that initial confrontation, a different kind of story began to circulate. One that spoke not of scandal, but a quiet, unshakable loyalty. The story of a giant who had stood between a friend and certain danger without a moment's hesitation, and a performer who had repaid that sacrifice not with grand gestures or public declarations, but with a kind of loyalty that revealed itself only when it truly mattered. The wrestling exhibition, once thought canceled indefinitely, was quietly rescheduled for several weeks later. When the night finally arrived, the arena was packed beyond capacity, word having spread through every corner of the city about the giant who had reportedly stood up to one of the most feared men in their world and walked away victorious. As he made his entrance that night, stepping into the ring beneath blazing lights and thunderous applause, the crowd's reaction carried an intensity that went far beyond typical enthusiasm for a wrestling spectacle. This was reverence. This was a city expressing gratitude to a man who had, in one extraordinary moment of courage, reminded them all that even in a world controlled by fear and violence, dignity and loyalty could still triumph. Dean was there that night, seated in a private box near the ring, watching with quiet pride as the giant moved through his exhibition match with the same effortless power that had defined his reputation throughout the wrestling world. Between rounds, their eyes met across the crowded arena, and in that brief, silent exchange, an understanding passed between them that neither man needed a voice aloud, a recognition of everything they'd endured together, and everything that bond now meant for both of their futures. In the years that followed, the story of that night would be told and retold throughout the entertainment world, growing with each retelling into something approaching legend. Some versions exaggerated the violence. Others softened it into something closer to comedy. But the essential truth at its core remained unchanged and, in many ways, more powerful than any embellished version could ever capture. That in a world built upon fear, intimidation, and the casual cruelty of powerful men who believed themselves untouchable, one man's decision to stand up for another, without hesitation and without concern for his own safety, had proven more powerful than every gun, every threat, every ounce of manufactured fear that world could produce. The boss, for his part, never fully recovered his previous standing within that world. Whispers of his financial betrayal, though never formally exposed, seemed to trail him like a quiet shadow for the remainder of his career, his associates regarding him from that point forward with wariness that had not existed before, as though some fundamental trust had been irreparably damaged the moment word of his private humiliation reached ears he could never quite identify. Within a few years, his influence within that city's casino industry had diminished considerably, replaced by younger, hungrier men eager to claim the territory and respect he had once commanded so absolutely. Dean's career, meanwhile, continued its remarkable ascent, his performances taking on a subtle new depth that longtime fans struggled to fully articulate, but nonetheless felt in every note he sang, every joke he delivered between songs. Those closest to him understood the source of that change, even if they never spoke of it publicly, having witnessed firsthand exactly how fragile the line between celebrated stardom and casual disposability truly was within that world. Dean carried forward a quiet, unshakable gratitude that infused every performance with a genuine warmth audiences couldn't help but respond to. And the giant, the man who had risked everything for a stranger's dignity on a single, chaotic night in a smoke-filled casino, went on to become one of the most beloved figures not just within the wrestling world, but within the entire entertainment industry of that era, his legend growing not merely from his extraordinary physical presence, but from the countless stories that circulated about his kindness, his loyalty, and his unwavering willingness to stand up for those who couldn't stand, up for themselves. Years later, long after that particular casino had changed ownership multiple times, long after the neon lights of that era had been replaced by newer, brighter, more corporate spectacles, those who had witnessed that night firsthand would still gather occasionally, usually over quiet drinks in dimly lit bars, to tell the story once more to anyone willing to listen. They spoke of the sound of that slap echoing through a silent casino floor. They spoke of the giant's slow, deliberate walk across that crowded room, and the way 8 armed men had found themselves utterly powerless against the simple, unshakable conviction of a man who refused to let cruelty go unanswered. They spoke of the quiet, dangerous game of leverage that followed, fought not with fists or bullets, but with information and courage in equal measure. And every single time, No matter how many years had passed, no matter how many details had blurred or transformed in retelling, the story ended the same way it always had, with a simple, powerful truth that resonated with everyone who heard it, a truth that transcended the specific details of casinos and mob bosses and giants and crooners, reaching instead towards something universal about the nature of courage itself. Because in a world built entirely upon fear, where power was measured in guns and money and the casual cruelty of men who believed themselves untouchable, it had taken just one person, standing quietly but immovably between danger and innocent friend, to prove that even the most feared empires could be humbled by nothing more than unwavering loyalty and the simple, unshakable refusal to look away when someone needed protecting. That, in the end, was a legacy that outlasted every headline, every rumor, every exaggerated retelling passed down through the years. Not the violence, not the danger, but the simple, profound reminder that courage often arrives not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in a single, quiet decision to stand your ground when everyone else around you has already decided to look away. And that sometimes all it takes to bring the most powerful men in the world to their knees is one person brave enough to say, simply and without hesitation, not tonight.